I saw 2 articles in the New York Times about 2 different protests. One protest was at Jeffries and Daughtry's house, and another protest was at a white dude's house who was doing something with the Crown Heights thing. I forget what his name is. The white guy? I don't know. I had to read you the article. I got the article up here. I don't know who the white guys were, but Sharpton and these people went to this neighborhood. Okay. And what's he do? And he was on LIB, but Coakley wasn't. Right, district, okay. Now, when they had the protest, they put Jeffries' address, home address, and Daughtry's home address in the New York Times. I got it in Washington, D.C. It went all over the country. Now, you know how much hate mail and other harassment are going to come from them Jewish people at the New York Times, right? Right? When's the last time y'all had a protest at the New York Times? See, now that the Post and that Daily News got here, they do so much shit you leave them alone. See, they the biggest. Well, see, the Post is not your biggest enemy because the New York Times is worldwide. They set world impression. The Post is for to rash you in the counter and shadow box with, while the New York Times, the real monster killer, sets impressions worldwide. The similar story on the protest at the white boy's house does not contain the white boy's address. Now, or his house. It says his neighborhood. And what I'm saying to that is that then the reporters, the 2 reporters, and I'm going to read you their names, you should find their addresses, and we should put their addresses on the flyer to let them know the consequences of exposing these brothers' families. See, I take that personally. I have 2 children, 8 and 7. Now, in all the time I fought with the Jewish people, ain't nobody ever come nowhere near my neighborhood because the people in the neighborhood developed a system that if a white man even came on our block, they would stop them and question them, why are you here? Now, that's what they did for my family, the little gang boys. The little gang boys didn't nobody want. That's what they did to protect my children. Now, the flip side is that when they put those addresses there, them men's families, then they make their families vulnerable to the opposition, and you can never let that signal go out. You cannot let that signal go out without jamming the 2 reporters, and please, before I stop, make me read you their names and the dates of the article. Well, shit, y'all act like. Right now. Count that bucket, Roy. What we got in that bucket? Everybody's so pushy.
You to make your point.
In that community, and the Jewish community stood with the black community against the people who came into that community.
Yes. Here are, incidentally, I don't think anyone was injured here, but it did get ugly, as you can see. And the right to march was granted by the New Jersey Supreme Court. Are you there?
The problem was, and what the task was, I realized it was part of the sacred mission that we as black folk have, to try to right things that are wrong. And those of us who have carved out education as our area realize that we have to do a major job. Major surgery has to take place in the educational arena because the educational arena was designed to support the system of white supremacy that was institutionalized in this nation. That's what education was for. The legal system was designed to support the system of white supremacy in this nation. The economic system was the heart of the system of white supremacy in this nation. And the cultural system went along with that. Movies and all the rest of it. For years, I grew up as a youngster just like you did, going to movies where the African peoples were completely denigrated. That was a conspiracy planned and plotted and programmed out of Hollywood, with people called Greenberg and Weisberg and Trigliani and whatnot. It's not being anti-Semitic to mention who developed Hollywood. Their names are there. MGM, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, Adolf Zukor, Fox, Russian Jewry had a particular control over the movies. And their financial partners, the mafia, put together a system of destruction of black people. Talk about self-image and self-esteem. This was an important part of the cultural development of any youth. We went to the movies every Saturday and saw the Native Americans being wiped out and Africans being denigrated. Sambo images, Beulah, Stephen Fletcher. That's what they put up there. It was by design. It was calculated. So we have to see that there is a war against the African. Now, I knew it before, but I didn't know how devilish it was going to get, or could be, from nice white people. See, you don't feel so bad, you know, you don't feel so bad if you got to go up against someone who is really down and out devilish and doggish. But if you get the smiling people like Diane Ravitch, I'm trying to do the right thing. And I have done the right thing all these years. Read Diane Ravitch's record. Look at her track record. This is the ultimate, supreme, sophisticated, debonair racist. Pure and simple. And when Asa Hilliard and the others called her Miss Daisy, they did it right. And Asa said, we're going to let Miss Daisy drive her own damn car from now on. And Miss Daisy has several partners. Albert Shanker's been holding her hand for some time. And now he's at the door of the governor, beating him up, saying, you've got to go against this latest report. They went against our report, using me as the scapegoat, that some nasty person has gotten control of the educational system. So then they put in place a sanitized committee. They checked these people out on the computers. Ran the computer. Blah, blah, blah. Good, sound, qualified, achieving Negro. No problem. Good, sound, Native American. No problem. In other words, computers. But see, they don't know, and don't you all tell them, the power of the African Holy Ghost. You see, once that African Holy Ghost starts moving around, whatever their calculations was is thrown off. And that African Holy Ghost started working, and that committee with only a few blacks, which was supposed to be not only sanitized, but it was supposed to be dominated and led by rich white men with property and power. Arthur Schlesinger, distinguished professor at City University, and had been with the Kennedys and had been at Harvard. And then the melting pot man. What was his name? Glazer. Nathan Glazer, Dr. Nathan Glazer. Melting pot Glazer. And then Dr. Kenneth Jackson. Now these three were supposed to dominate the other 20. But see, they underestimated the African Holy Ghost. And once Dr. Eleni Tedley felt that Holy Ghost, because she's from Ethiopia. Now you know the Holy Ghost has been roaming around Ethiopia for a long time. Ethiopia is the oldest Christian nation. That Holy Ghost is there. And Lalibela built the New Jerusalem in the 12th century. 12 stone churches, not from the ground up. Wonders of the world, Lalibela in Ethiopia, from the ground down to protect them from the Muslim invasions. Holy Ghost in Ethiopia. So Eleni Tedley got her stuff together and brought it to the table. And then little Diane Glover, she's just a school teacher. But she found the strength tapping into the African Holy Ghost that she was a dynamite. Looked Glazer and Schlesinger in the eye and said, you are not correct. I do not agree, Dr. Glazer. Here's little Diane Glover, school teacher out in Long Island and Queens. Look at these big white men with property, power, and prestige. They knew they had met their match. So Schlesinger, being a weakling and not prepared to learn and grow, stepped off of the committee. This is how slick and devilish they are. He refused to be in the committee because he saw the learning process that these sisters and brothers bringing that material to the table that they all had to digest was changing the committee. The truth was manifesting itself. So he said, I'm going to step off, but not really step off. That's how slick and devilish and dirty and dastardly they are. He said, I just want to be a consultant. Be a consultant so he's privy to all the material and what they're doing, but not a part of what it is, so that he could go out and contact American Express and produce a devilish volume such as this called The Disuniting of America, a political tract passing off as a scholarly document. This is why they're unconscionable. They refuse to sit down with any of us and discuss any of these matters. They let their newspaper people jump up with these articles. Here is a book that's supposed to be the definitive book on the reflections on a multicultural society. And it's really a reflections on the African. Nobody else is mentioned in this book except African peoples. No Asians are mentioned. They're not attacked. No Native Americans. No Latinos are attacked. The Africans are attacked, and our pictures are put in here. Pictures of Asa Hilliard, pictures of Maleficenti, pictures of Malana Karanga in the margin. And I've never seen a book like this. How could they put this out? Between every chapter is an advertisement for Federal Express. An advertisement for Federal Express. And this is the book that's going to be talking about the disuniting of America. We talk about pimps and prostitutes parading. I mean, I hate to be, you see my reaction. And I'm trying to be very cool, calm, and collected. And they even had to put one of us. Provides immediate relief from stress and anxiety. Federal Express advertisement. In between the chapter on the new race. This is the chapter on the new race, and then they have this black fellow there. History, the weapon. And then they have some of our pictures. But you know, the battle for the schools. What this reveals is that what we're, and then they have little Diane Ravage. They just gave her a little picture in the corner. Miss Daisy. Adjunct professor at City College. At Columbia. Not a professor. Miss Daisy has not passed muster to be a professor. Dr. Gordon and I have passed muster to be a professor. Miss Daisy was there as an adjunct because she brought in a grant. She's hooked up with the grants with the Heritage Foundation and these other conservative foundations because he's doing the work of these devilish folks. In fact, she is the new standard. The old standard was a Bible Belt Texas rural family. That's the standard for the textbooks that went into the schools for generations. Now the new standard is not a Bible Belt Texas family, but a sophisticated Texas Jew. And that standard is not good enough either. Because many people, such as the Ravages, who happen to be Jewish, have blinded us from the attack coming from the Jewish community. Systematic, unrelenting. And until we can look at it and deal with it, there's no efforts we can make that are going to be successful. Not anti-Semitic to raise the issues, but if you do not deal with it, you are fooling yourself. There's an orchestrated attack by the Schlesingers and the Shankers, working with the white conservatives, the George Wills, the Heritage Foundation. We're pinpointing their relationship. We're putting it to our African computer. The document is being prepared. And they know who to point to. So the largest photo in the darn book is Len Jeffries. He doesn't get in the margin. He's got a whole big thing there. And so people around me say, Len, they're targeting you for death. I said, that's cool. That means I must be doing something right. I've lived 44 years on this plane. And if I haven't done what I should do by then, there's not much more I'm going to do. Malcolm only had 39. Martin only had 39. So death is not a thing. I'm not going to back down no matter what. They picked on the right person at the right time, and they're not going to win this one. And in fact, I called the New York Times after they attacked me last year, and I told them, thank you for making me a folk hero among my people, wherever I go. And thank you for introducing me to scholars around the world. Most of you don't realize that when the New York Times put in the paper that Jeffries says rich Jews were involved in the enslavement process, they put that in there to paint me as an anti-Semitic. An anti-Semitic does not stay at City College for 20 years as chairman of a department and have friends, even those who do not like him, and his enemies respect him at City College. And the head Jew at City College, Dr. Bernard Sommer, saw me after the article in the Times, said, Len, everybody knows rich Jews helped finance the slave trade. If everybody knows it, then let's put it in the classroom. Miss Ravitch says that black people sold black people into slavery. She don't hesitate to say that. Schlesinger says black people sold black people into slavery. Let's talk about who financed, planned, operated, maintained the slave system. Let's talk about every slave ship being blessed by a Protestant minister or a Catholic priest. Let's talk about the Catholic Church initiating the enslavement of African people. Let's talk about the Danes, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, the Scots, the Swedes, the Brandenburg Germans that were involved in the enslavement of Africa for hundreds of years. Jews and Gentiles, Arabs and Christians. Let's deal with the whole ball of wax. Let's not just say Africans sold Africans into enslavement. But I don't do anything unless I'm backed up with documentation. So the Ravages and whatnot know I have documentation. They don't want to come by me. They sent their leading emissary, Edward I. Koch. And Eddie called me up, wrote me a letter. Dr. Jeffries, I'd like you to come down to my office so we can discuss your documentation and what these things are you're dealing with. I thought he wasn't serious. But I realized he had been on TV the week before and said, Jeffries is wrong because he's teaching racism in his class. Levin is right because he's not teaching it in his class. This is this convoluted logic and rationality of white folks who are pathological, affected by racism. So most people told me, don't be bothered with him. Adelaide Sanford, Dr. Sanford said, you can't deal with him. The man will distort anything you say. Dr. Clark said, don't worry about him. But the African Holy Ghost said, with your truth, you can go anywhere and deal with anybody. And since he is the biggest and the baddest that they got, you got to take on their best so you don't have to worry about the rest. And so Dr. J called them up and said, I'm interested in your proposition, but I have a condition. I'm not coming. I want you to come up to my office. Oh, no, I couldn't come up to your office. I said, well, I have all the books and everything up here. Well, no, I couldn't do that because that would cause, be too much of a publicity. So I said, well, I'll come down to your office, but first you've got to give up my pyramids. He said, what? I said, I would not even consider a dialogue unless you are prepared to give up my pyramid. I said, we have a picture of you riding on a camel around the pyramid several years ago talking about your ancestors built them thousands of years ago. We got another picture of Menachem Begin dancing in front of the pyramids that his ancestors built thousands of years ago. We want our pyramids back, and there's no need to even dialogue unless you're prepared to give them up. See, you have to operate from some strength. If you operate from weakness, doubt, and you don't know what you're doing, there's no need to be in the ballpark. Let the Gordons, Jeffries, and others do the shooting, because you all be shooting the wrong people and using the wrong ammunition. What I'm saying is you've got to master the understanding of your own experience and your history and have this knowledge. It's there, it's available, it's in the books. You've got to study. You set up study groups. Put these study groups in your homes, in your churches, in your apartment houses, on your jobs, and study this material. It's there. Then you can be as firm and sure as the others of us are. The Wade Nobles and the Hakeem Mataboudis and the Nayam Akbars and the Francis Cress Wells. This material is there. We haven't produced any magic to get at this material. We're just more disciplined, hard-working, more persistent than others. So once he was prepared to give up my pyramid, and I always carry the image of the pyramids around. Once he was prepared to give them up, I said I would come down. And he called in from Hong Kong to tell his people, tell Jeffries he can have his pyramids back. So my brother said, look, I can't allow you to go down there by yourself. This is my little brother. He's in a heavy African martial arts. And that's why it's good to have these little brothers. He said, I'm going down with you because my aura will protect you. So the Jeffries boys from Newark, New Jersey went down to Rockefeller Plaza to meet Edward I. Koch. I rolled down, just as I rolled this stuff here and all these books, I don't go nowhere without your ammunition. There's no need to begin a war and you ain't armed. You're just mouthing and woofing. Take your ammunition. And so we rolled into Koch's office with all of this stuff. First thing I saw, and he wanted to know, where's your documentation? I said, we have it all here. But before he could say anything, I said, look, that thing over there on the cabinet, we're going to have to deal with before we do anything. He said, what? What? I said, that Statue of Liberty. What do you mean? Well, you're not familiar with the Statue of Liberty? Yes, the Statue of Liberty is in the harbor. No, its background, the reason for it being. I said, the Statue of Liberty has not a darn thing to do with your immigrant forebears. It has to do with my forebears fighting for liberty in these United States. He tried to act cool, but it was clear he was becoming discombobulated. When I showed him some of the documentation, he knew he was in a war for control of the mind, and so he left and said, I'll be back. And he brought in his Dr. Clark, Attorney Wolf, and sat him in the room. So here it was, my brother and I, the Jeffries boys, with Attorneys Wolf and Koch. We presented the information, and Koch, after an hour, got what I call cognitive dissonance. That's what happens when this new information is brought before the folks. Cognitive dissonance is a much nicer term, a psychological term where imbalance, disharmony occurs when new information is, but I like to call it racial pathology, but cognitive dissonance is good enough for those who cannot digest racial pathology. Well, cognitive dissonance started to set in, and after a while he got so uncomfortable. He asked me about, well, what is this about? You had said something about rich Jews and involved in the enslavement of Africans. So I said, where do you want us to start? What period of history? You want us to start in the Spanish, Portuguese period of the starting of the slave trade in the 1400s and 1500s? Do you want us to move it from Seville and Lisbon on to Amsterdam and Hamburg, where the new Jewish community in those areas continued the slave trade for the Dutch, the Germans, and the English? Or do you want us to move it to Brazil and the Caribbean and Curacao, which became the new Amsterdam, the new center of the slave trade in the Western world, centered around the Jewish immigrants that moved into Curacao? Or do you want us to move it to New York and Newport, Rhode Island? Where do you want us to start? Newport, Rhode Island, at the time of the American Revolution, was the leading slaving center in America. And that was the home of the largest Jewish community and most active, wealthy Jewish community in America, Newport, Rhode Island. Where do you want to start, Mayor? Well, what books do you have? Well, we have a book here. Aaron Lopez of Newport, in the 1750s and 60s, one of the largest slavers out of Newport, Rhode Island, a community that had a number of outstanding wealthy Jews who not only controlled a couple hundred of the slave ships, Aaron Lopez himself controlling a couple of dozen, but they controlled most, if not all, of the 30 distilleries that processed molasses from the Caribbean into rum to be sold to the Native Americans as firewater and to be sold to Africa for enslaved Africans. Where do you want to start? You want to go back into the Spanish, Sephardic, Jewish community? Then get Stephen Birmingham's, the Grandees. The Grandees, the Jewish rich that supported the Spanish strong and helped lay the foundation for the enslavement in the 1400s and 1500s. Even after the Jewish community was persecuted in Spain with the Inquisition in 1492, many of them that converted to Christianity stayed in Spain and helped the Spanish king and queen, who was anti-Semitic, Queen Isabella, helped her maintain the slave system against the Africans and Native Americans. Where do you want to start? Do you want to go to Amsterdam and get a book by Jonathan Israel on European Jewry in the age of mercantilism? 1550 to 1550 to 1750. And there's a picture of the Amsterdam synagogue, which was the center of slave trading for the Dutch. Amsterdam became the leading port in this period of time for slaving. And it was around this synagogue that the slaving system was established. Now, we're not talking about most Jews. Most Jews were being beat up and down Europe and persecuted for being Jewish. We're talking about rich Jews, and we specifically make that distinction. We're not talking about white folks in general when we talk about oppression. We're talking about the wealthy white folks, the powerful white folks that make the decision. So let's make some decisions, some clarity when we're talking about these things. But the documentation is there. We are now preparing the 10 volumes dealing with the Jewish relationship with the black community in reference to slavery, so we can put it in the school system. So there'll be no question about Miss Daisy, Arthur Schlesinger. Schlesinger in his book said, Dr. Jeffries said something about the Jews involved in enslavement, and then he just leaves it there. I asked this man who called me from California, I said, what is the reference that he cites? The New York Times. I said, that's not a reference to cite. Well, they quote you being quoted from some other newspaper. I said that the original quote was not correct, and so anything else after that is not correct. Why didn't he contact me and find out what it is that we're saying? Everybody was involved in the enslavement of Africans. But if we want to deal with slavery, let's deal with it, and I'm going to lay this down. That's why we're being attacked. You see, if they had just let us put a few black folks in the curriculum and been satisfied with that, then there would be no problem, and we would have been satisfied. But they didn't want us to do that. So our intellectual abilities and capacities and our sacred mission has pushed us into serious study and analysis. No one has studied more than myself in the last couple of years and the people around me. Producing documents, position papers, Dr. Carruthers, Dr. Asante, Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Shashi McIntyre, my wife. We have been in a heavy study, and what has been revealed is a mind-boggling process. We will have the 10 major books relating to the Jewish community, the wealthy Jewish community, and enslaved. In Spain, they were the grandees, managing the money of the Spanish throne. In Germany, in the 16 and 1700s, they were the court Jews, managing the political and economic apparatus of Europe, the Habsburg Empire, the German states, etc. We have the names. We know who they were, what they controlled. We know when they set up the Dutch East Indian Company, the Dutch West Indian Company, the Portuguese Company, the Brazilian Company. We know who and what documents. We know the family connections. We know that even when they converted to Christianity, they maintained links with their Jewish community brothers who had not converted. And that's why they had a network around the world. But even more than that, if you keep digging and as quiet as it's kept, a number of Jewish scholars from around the country sent me documentation on the Jews' involvement in slave trade. Not one wrote to me contesting what they thought I had said. A dozen sent me information, including a Sunni professor. And then we discovered in my copy room, I don't know, the African Holy Ghost works in wondrous ways. African Holy Ghost put a book in my copy room called The Jews of Germany by Lowenthal. And it details the movement of the Jewish community into Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, along with the Syrians and Lebanese, and they became the lifeline of the fallen Roman Empire in the 15 and 1600s. And they began to institutionalize a trade link with the Middle East. That trade link dealt with, number one, number two, furs, and number one, it dealt with humans. The humans that it dealt with for hundreds of years were the Slavic peoples of Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, the Czechs, the Poles, the Yugoslavs, the Russians. An alliance between the Catholic Church and rich Jews selling white Central, Eastern, and Southern Europeans into Arab slavery. The truth shall set you free. Did you hear what I said? The white slave trade in Europe, because the Central and Eastern Europeans were pagans, they were not Christians, Catholic Church had no allegiance to them. And the Jewish community didn't care either which way. So rich Jews and the Catholic Church had an alliance for hundreds of years, selling white folks from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe into slavery in the Arab world, the white slave trade, which is the precursor of enslavement later. In fact, the term slavery is rooted in the word Slavs. You see why we're in trouble? If they had just let us alone and let us put Louis Lattimore, Granville Woods, and Norbert Richelieu, and Jan Masalega, and they just let us alone, we would have been so worried about putting these people in the curriculum that we wouldn't have to dig up these truths. But we might as well go for the whole ball of wax, getting ourselves prepared for the 21st century. It's in the works. It's in the material. You just have to grab a hold of it. Let me quickly try to say what I'm trying to say. Who have to refashion themselves, even those of us with these PhDs and BBDs. You need to tap into a whole nother level of knowledge that is available to you so that when someone talks about this symbol and they take you down to Washington, D.C., and you take your little kiddies and you say, look, Sammy, and look, Mary Jo, look at the monument they built for George Washington, and you don't have the knowledge, critical understanding, or cultural literacy to say, look, Sammy, and look, Mary Jo, at the African monument of resurrection that was refashioned for George Washington, the slave master bastard, founding father. But there's a new ball game. We have the information on the Statue of Liberty. When it first came out, it was a student that gave it to me, and I'm going to run for these next few minutes. There's a student that gave me the information because a black chemist, Jack Felder, had compiled an information sheet with the data and information where you could find it. And when we put our information out there, we need to put at the end of it the documentation source where we can discover this information. And so when he put the documentary data, et cetera, I followed it up, being a consummate scholar. I grabbed some of the Sons of Africa. We jumped in a couple of cars, went down to the New York City Museum, 106th Street and 5th Avenue, looking for this black Statue of Liberty. The first model was of an image of a black woman holding the broken chains of enslavement with the broken chains of enslavement at her feet. Nobody there knew anything about it. All the people there were blacks, 5 or 6 blacks, and ain't nobody knew nothing. I refused to leave. Black folks got cognitive dissonance. They didn't want to understand, didn't want to do nothing. But when I refused to leave, then they start to thinking. And then they said, well, there was a Haitian guard who was there. So they said, go get him. Maybe he knows something. He was there in '86 when they had the celebration. So they go get the Haitian guard. He said, of course, the model for Statue of Liberty is downstairs. I said, can we see it? No, the director has the key locked up. Ain't nobody can see it. So I said, well, is there any other information about the Statue of Liberty? He went off, came back with a book by Marvin Trachtenberg called The Statue of Liberty. And in it, he opened it up and showed the various models of the Statue of Liberty with the chains at the feet. Then the brother Felder said, you can go down to the French Cultural Center. That's further down on 5th Avenue, 83rd Street or 82nd Street and 5th Avenue. I went there, knocked on the door, just got in there just in time. I had called them before and asked them, did they have any information on the Statue of Liberty? And they gave me a large magazine called Liberty, the anniversary edition of the magazine France, and that dealt with the founding of the Statue of Liberty. It had a picture of Edouard René Lefleur de la Boulay, the Frenchman who came up with the idea of the Statue of Liberty. He was a political scientist. He was a French leader. He was a French parliamentarian. He wrote a 3-volume history of the United States, but more important than that, Edouard René Lefleur de la Boulay, who came up with the idea of the Statue of Liberty in 1865, was head of the French Anti-Slave Society. In 1865, people were not interested in immigration into the United States. In fact, the United States in the 1850s, 1860s had established a know-nothing party. They did not want immigrants. They were against immigrants, and the immigrants that they were against were Papists, German and Irish Catholics. There was no prospect of bringing in immigrants from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. These were the unwashed masses. 1865 was our period. 1865 is when 500,000 black people, 250,000 of them official Union Army Navy troops, participated in the Civil War, freeing 4 million of their compatriots, and then saving this nation. The question of black folks getting into their history has nothing to, and fighting for their liberty and struggling for what is right, is not the question of disuniting America. It has been our struggle that has kept America united. It has been our struggle that has raised anew the liberties that this nation professes. It has been our struggle that has created the 14th Amendment that became the amendment that the women could use and others could use when they talked about the expansion of liberty in America. America was founded by rich white men with property and power. It was founded on an affirmative action program for rich white men with property and power. From the very beginning of the founding of these colonies, rich white men with property and power were given affirmative action and set-asides, whole land set aside for them to develop. and whole people set aside to work it for free, including white folks who came as virtual slaves under indentured servitude. There was a set-aside and affirmative action for rich white folks with property and power in the beginning of this nation, and that tradition under the British and under the Dutch was maintained. And when independence was established, the independence was established, and the Constitution put in place in 1787 is a document of affirmative action for rich white folks with property and power. Because we do not have the critical analysis we need, and that's why we need study groups, serious study groups for the adults and for the teachers, we continue to go around talking about there was a 3/5 clause put in the Constitution, and we had 3/5 rights of white folks. You had no rights in the American constitutional frame of reference. Women had no significant rights. The Constitution did not speak to them, and poor men did not have any significant rights in the Constitution. The Constitution speaks to rich white men with property and power. It's there for you to read with your eyes open and to put an analysis to it. 3/5 clause in affirmative action and a set-aside for the slave owners. A slave owner who had 200 of our peoples enslaved had 3/5 more voting power for them than a normal rich white man. That's democracy. That's oligarchy. But we still posture a position of democracy as part of the founding process. Democracy came as we struggled to widen the American process to include the most deprived and dispossessed of the people in the system. Our struggle has been the heroic struggle. It's an enormous struggle. If you can only tap into it, if you only knew it, the struggle of our people collectively for freedom, justice, we have been the liberating people force in this nation from day one when we arrived. And that Constitution, if you read it again, in two places it mentions black folks, is this 3/5 clause, and then they got this question of 1808. 1808 is a set-aside for rich white men with property and power, the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the Monroes. A set-aside. Instead of ending slavery in 1787, which they could have done, if they were lovers of freedom, justice, and equality. Instead of ending the slave trade in 1787, which they could have done, if their Declaration of Independence meant anything to them. We hold all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If they really believed that, they could have instituted a constitution that destroyed these things as the French did. But they did not believe it because the nation was founded by rich white men with property and power. They put the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and everything together. So they set aside 20 years for them to continue the slave trade up until 1808. Set-asides for rich white men with property and power become what has been the basis of this nation. And then they beat up on us about affirmative action and set-asides for what we've contributed to America. So you've got to have an analysis. That's what we're saying. And just let me give you this one frame of reference to show how this enormity of material can be processed in a way to make it work for you. And then we'll have the question and answer period. I come up with
controversial speech on Donahue. How could it happen? For 2 years, an 8-year-old girl is beaten, burned, and held prisoner in her own home. Al meets Mickey. We'll take you to a gala 20th anniversary party, Disney style. Will this 12-year-old girl's dream come true? The touching story of her battle against all odds, starting at 5.
To the fact that what makes Professor Jeffries an especially important public figure today is the contribution that he was asked to make as a tenured professor in charge of the Black Studies Department here at CUNY about what your children should learn, for example, about the slave trade, how the slaves get here, who brought them here. Professor Jeffries is saying, as he did in a speech in Albany, that one of the main hands in the slave trade were wealthy Jews. Here's how he put it.
And there's a picture of the Amsterdam synagogue, which was the center of slave trading for the Dutch. Amsterdam became a leading port in this period of time for slaving. And it was around this synagogue that the slaving system was established. Now, we're not talking about most Jews. Most Jews were being beat up and down Europe and persecuted for being Jewish. We're talking about rich Jews, and we specifically make that distinction. We're not talking about white folks in general when we talk about oppression. We're talking about the wealthy white folks, the powerful white folks that make the decisions. So let's make some decisions, some clarity when we're talking about these things. But the documentation is there.
And let's get some clarity. We've had a clip with Diane Ravitch and the statement of the books. And before we even get to a discussion of that, another clip goes out, okay? We're not going to allow this to happen. There's going to be clarity. The question of Diane Ravitch was raised because she has self-appointed herself to be the arbiter of what should be taught in the curriculum around the United States. What we are saying is that for generations, my generations and others went through a school where the major textbook was David Seville Muzzy, a professor at Columbia University, and that textbook was such that it was geared to meeting what would be accepted by Bible Belt Christians in Texas, which meant that Bible Belt Christians in rural Texas would not accept anything positive about black folks. So in those textbooks, for generations, there was nothing positive about black folk. What we are saying very clearly, that even though a more sophisticated person has come in from Texas, and she is not a Bible Belt Christian, and she happens to be a Jew, her lack of understanding of the experience of Africans, Asians, and Latinos is such that neither is her standard good enough. And we say that clearly. It is not a reference to someone being Jewish. Now, the question that has just been raised here was a question of what do we say about enslavement? And we've been saying this for many years. I first went to Africa in 1961. And every time we go to Ghana, where along the west coast of Africa there is, in a 200-mile stretch, 40 slave forts and dungeons put in place by the Europeans. For hundreds of years, this is where the degradation of African peoples took place. Some of those dungeons hold thousands. I was in Cape Coast Dungeon and Elmina Dungeon when this controversy broke, communing with our ancestors, the tens of millions pulled out of Africa by all sorts of Europeans. And we do not single out one group. We never have. And we will not let it happen today. Okay. Let's get clarity on this matter. It was the New York Times that first raised this issue in April the 20th, 1990, after a Mr. Berger came into my classroom. We have the tape of Mr. Berger coming in the classroom. We know what we said, and we did not single out the rich Jewish population. We talked about everybody being involved in the enslavement. He specifically had an agenda. And we're going to show the world that tape when we get a chance to. He specifically had an agenda which was to stamp me as anti-white, anti-Semitic, and a person with crazy ideas. That went into the New York Times, April the 20th, 1990, to impact on the vote of the Board of Regents, which was to take place the following week. It did not work. The red herring of anti-Semitism, anti-white did not work. The Board of Regents voted April the 27th to start making curricular change 17-0. Over the next year, they put in place a committee to do that. And that committee came up with a document called We Are One Peoples, Culturally Interdependent. It was produced in June, 91. Because of the battle raged against us by the Ravages and others, they had lost battle after battle. Now the question of the war was being decided. And this committee of 24 voted 22-2 to put in place changes in the social studies curriculum. This meant that it was going before the Board of Regents. Again, the articles came out, again raising me up. But the Board of Regents voted July the 27th or 26th to start curricular change. I think it was 11-3, a favorable vote. July the 26th, they had lost the war. Then they proceeded with Plan Chaos. And that's when, within 10 days, I was raised up as the red flag to cloud the issue of curricular change. That is the history, and we need to understand it.
From your speech to Albany, here is a reference Professor Jeffrey makes to his own. I'll give you a chance here.
We want to get clarity on this issue.
Yeah,
let
me get this on, because we got tape to get in. You will have a chance. Here's Professor Jeffries talking about his own college experience.
What the white boy has said is the only thing significant is the skills function. So he tests on the skills function, and then he decides whether we've had an education or not, based upon tests. I'm here to tell you that test taking is no more than anything but testing test taking. I was in the Jewish fraternity in college. Most of you may not have known that. I'm supposed to meet one of my fraternity brothers on Monday, Billy Rothschild, for dinner. I was the president of the Jewish fraternity. 100 Jews and me and a couple of Christians. And the president of the Jewish fraternity was called a Rex. So I had to go through college as the Rex, the king of the Jews. Now, I managed it. But the most important thing about that fraternity was they had a system, that they knew how to take tests, they knew how to put a system of support in place, they had the records of all of the professors, they had their tests, they analyzed how they changed their questions from year to year to try to fool the students. We left nothing to chance. The Jewish fraternity won the scholarship trophy 14 semesters in a row. The whole average of the fraternity was a Dean's List average. Even dumb Jews made it because there was a system of support. My roommate was a black youngster from the football star Dan Wooten from Cape May, New Jersey. He was the vice president. So in the 1950s at Lafayette College, the president of this Jewish fraternity was black. The vice president was black, 2 boys from New Jersey. Dan Wooten is now a medical doctor, surgeon, UCLA Medical School, Charles Drew Medical Center, King Hospital in Los Angeles. And of course you know about Dr. J. But other people have a system. The important thing I'm saying is that other people have a system. We have to put a system in place. It begins in the home. It should be in our communities, in our fraternal orders, in our clubs. But we don't have that type of understanding. We're not playing the game of politics and education the way we should.
Professor Jeffries has an opportunity to make his point in just a moment.
Hold on a minute.
Right.
Lewis Latimer and Granville Woods are black Americans who made an enormous contribution to, for example, the filament that allows us to see and that we use in our studio today. One of the points carbon filament. One of the points Professor Jeffries makes is they get almost no reference in anybody's social studies book. Another example of blacks being deprived of the contributions of their own forebears to what helps. He makes the point, and others, in this clip from his speech. Here it is.
So rich Jews and the Catholic Church had an alliance for hundreds of years, selling white folks from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe into slavery in the Arab world, the white slave trade, which is the precursor of enslavement later. In fact, the term slavery is rooted in the word Slavs. You see why we're in trouble? If they had just let us alone and let us put Lewis Latimer, Granville Woods, and Norbert Richelieu, and Jan Masaleka, and they just let us alone, we would have been so worried about putting these people in the curriculum that we wouldn't have to dig up these truths. But we might as well go for the whole ball of wax, getting ourselves prepared for the 21st century. It's in the works. It's in the material. You just have to grab a hold of it.
There you go.
Now may I speak?
Yes, you're
Professor Phil Donahue.
Yes, you may, Professor.
We were in a little time sequence where he was putting it out there and I couldn't catch up with it with an explanation, but maybe I'll have a few minutes.
Not a few, just a couple.
Okay.
I mean, not because I don't want to give it to you, I don't have
Well,
it.
you could have just played the clip, the whole program in Albany, and didn't have to have me here if we were not going to have an explanation. I'm glad that you have, and we can dialogue. Now, what I would like to say is that when the New York Times, with Berger writing this article, that I was anti-Semitic, anti-white, and had these crazy theories, when that was put in the paper, April the 20th, 1990, 50 major media from around the world descended upon me. British Broadcasting Company, Australia Nightline, Canadian Broadcasting Company, CNN, and they were all in my classes. We said we do not single out Jews. We do not single out any particular group. We talk about the collectivity of interest against African peoples in reference to these things. But because the vote of the Board of Regents was taking place, they had to raise these issues, crazy theories of these professors, that we have a theory of melanin that says black people are superior. We do not have a theory of melanin that says black people are superior. That was put in the paper, and they've run it every day you look, they have it. We do not have a theory of black people being superior intellectually because of melanin. It's a joke, but it's been run and run and run into the ground. But there was a man who was interested in what we were saying. His name was Edward I. Koch, the former mayor of this city. And he wrote me a letter and asked for me to come down to explain myself and bring the materials and books, etc. I said, come to my office because I can't bring my whole library. And he said, well, I can't. It would be too much of a media thing. So I went to his office with dozens of these books in Rockefeller Plaza. And here is our we have a tape of that. Both of us taped it, and we have a transcript of it. And here's our conversation. When we asked the question about enslavement, let me ask a couple of questions. Okay, this is in reference to enslavement. Because Diane Ravitch said in her article, and she says it again and again.
Speaking.
Yes. Okay, what was said was that Diane Ravitch, in the article that she wrote, said that Africans sold Africans to Africans and Africans sold them to white folks and Arabs, and just left it at that. And here's my answer. I said that everybody was involved in the enslavement of African peoples. This is May the 16th, 1990. The Catholic Church initiated the slave trade in the early 1400s and 1500s. The Pope apologized in the 1980s when he went to Africa. The Protestant Reformation was born at the same time that the slave trade was being institutionalized, and it was compromised on the altar of enslavement. Luther's Reformation began in 1517. 1516, the Asiento, the contract to take Africans systematically to the Spanish New World, was instituted. The Protestant Reformation is born at the same time as the systematic enslavement of Africans in the Spanish New World. It was the Pope and the Spanish throne that agreed to this enslavement. At the same time in Europe, much of the merchant banking trade was handled by Jews. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews poor in their communities. We're talking about merchants. Merchants have no nationality. They have no religion. Money is their religion. On the altar of profit making, we're not talking about rabbis. We're not talking about Jewish scholars. We're not talking about Jews who have been struggling to survive in Europe. We're talking about people who handle the money. And so, what have we to do is to get at the bottom of this matter. Get the Jewish people who called me and gave me the documentation. Get the Jewish scholars who called me and gave me books and references. No, but this point is so crucial that it has to be put in the hands of Jewish scholars to bring it out in a way that it should be brought out. It has to be put in the hands of Catholic scholars to bring it out so that Catholic Church involvement can be looked at and it will not be considered anti-Catholic. We've got to get some clarity on this issue. Yes, Africans sold Africans into slavery, but the slave system did not come out of the African experience. It was developed in Europe. It was conceived and planned and projected in Europe. It was part of a larger trade that was going on for hundreds of years in Europe, and which people in the Middle East and others were involved in the enslavement of the Slavs.
That's not the way you look in this speech. Professor, you never look at me.
Whenever we've raised the question, we've never raised it about one group. And
you
in fact,
certainly did in that speech.
No, that's not the whole speech, and you just provided clips.
Well, I did.
The same process that the New York Post and the New York Times, the same process that only Newsday put the whole speech in.
Very good. Very good.
There's been a media control over the process. People who have wanted to put the whole speech on the channels of our major TVs have been suppressed. Newspaper columnists who wanted to talk about it have been suppressed.
Your point is on the record. Excuse the interruption.
Constraint in this whole matter.
Your point is on the record.
Because people do not want to have the truth dealt with, and we as Africans have to live by that truth.
And we'll be back in just a moment. So what I understand you to be saying with the transcript that you read in your occasion of your visit with Mayor Koch is that New York media has focused in on your observations about the Jewish participation not only in the development of new curriculum but also in the slave trade was reported by media absent your indictment of Gentiles and others, including, as you acknowledge, occasionally black participation in the management of slave trade. And that your angst about this is not directed exclusively at the Jews. It's directed,
never has been.
It's directed at all people who are responsible for the slave trade, and you want little children, black, white, brown, growing up to see this kind of material accurately committed to textbooks. Do I understand you?
It is absolutely imperative that we deal with the truth. It is an insult of the most gross nature to have black youngsters in schools being trained and taught to look at Thomas Jefferson, to look at Washington, George Washington, to look at Madison and Monroe, and not see them for their fullness.
We agree.
They may have written all of these things, but Thomas Jefferson cannot be just seen as the author of the Declaration of Independence. He has to be seen as a slave master, a slave merchant, who did not even have the courage and the principledness to free his own children. That George Washington, you do not have to teach black youngsters or white youngsters something about a cherry tree. What you need to understand is why was George Washington fighting for independence from the British and at the same time institutionalizing a system of privilege and power for white folks that had slaves?
Yes.
We've got to deal with the contradictions.
We
in the founding
agree.
of the nation.
We agree, and
not,
thousands of other people
we are told
who have
when we
made...
raise these questions that we're anti.
You were told you were
truth.
anti-Semitic, is what
We're
we're
told we're anti-American. We're anti-white. We're told we're anti-everything, but we shall pursue this truth no matter where it goes and no matter whose finger is pointed at.
Yeah.
We have an obligation.
Yeah.
We have an obligation. Just like you would not ask the Irish people who have been victimized for 1,000 years by the English not to look at the truth of that experience in relationship to the Irish.
Yes.
You have to ask the Irish who were brought here by the English and others as indentured servants, virtual slaves in the beginning of this nation. You have to ask the Irish why they rioted during the draft period in 1863. Because they were seeing rich white men with property and power not serving in the army, and there they're going to put in draft laws to put the poor Irish in.
Yes.
You have to ask the whole historical question.
Right, and you have to ask yourself this question, Professor
We're not allowed to deal with these
You
books.
have to look at your speech again, and you have to ask yourself...
There's a fixation on the speech. I will
have
not allow...
I not?
There's a fixation on the speech. I have been much more than that speech.
Why are you ashamed of the speech that I showed? It's your speech. Well, let me speak about it for just a second.
That speech will be shown around the world, not in clips. The speech will be shown around the world, not in clips.
Well, Mr. Professor Jeffries, when you say, you cannot back up from your focus. You know, with Professor Jeffries, who incidentally now, you may be showing signs of grandiosity when you talk about around the world. Hang on just 1 second.
The Jewish community might have been 3 minutes, and that whole speech
is not 3 minutes.
Shown.
The Jews this, the Jews that, the Jews. You even made up names for Jews. Who is? Let me ask you: do you admire do you admire Schwerner and Goodman for the work they did, losing their lives for the civil rights cause in the South?
Let's deal with the Schwerner and Goodman issue because most people,
are you bored by the question?
Most people do not know that there was a third person. And he was Brother Cheney.
Yes.
And you always
most people do know that.
Well, Phil, let's deal with it.
All right, most people do know that.
Let's deal with it. I was in college in the 50s with my Jewish fraternity brothers, and I was very proud of that. And most of them are very proud of me. Even to this day, they have not bought into the lies. They cannot believe. He was the strongest of us. He was the best. He should have been our leader. We don't know what happened. Nothing has happened. I'm the same Leonard Jeffries that was with them for 4 years at Pi Lambda Phi. And our Jewish fraternity brothers will be getting together to get clarity on this. But we will not allow you to continue to follow the script. People raising up Goodwin and Schwerner, these were youngsters who had a commitment, and they went and gave their life to that commitment. There's no way we can say that is the commitment of most people. That's not the commitment of most white people. They didn't give a damn about black people. That's not the commitment of most even concerned white folks. Those were 2 youngsters who stand as committed youngsters. If we had more like them, we would be better off. But you cannot let others hide behind what they did. You can't let the real estate interest that structured an America based upon a white suburban formula that was symbolized by the Levitts and others who built Levittown, New Jersey, Levittown, Pennsylvania.
So the Jews did that too?
No,
then.
I'm saying a whole policy.
So the Jews are responsible. You cannot back up from the special focus you give to them.
We're talking about the formula of suburbia in America. It was not a Jewish phenomenon. There were Irish involved. There were Italians involved.
Well, why don't
America
you say
was involved in creating white suburbs. And so I'm saying you cannot take 2 youngsters who gave their lives and hide behind the reality that other things were being created.
Right.
Segregation in America was being created. Little white suburbs in America, so white folks could run out to these little homes and be away from black folks and create rot in the center of the cities, and no civilization can continue to endure if they allow their urban areas to rot, and that's what racism did in creating the suburban phenomena in America.
You would also admonish black brothers and sisters not to, you would also admonish white people, and most especially Jews, not to indict all black people for the remark, the Hymietown remark by Jesse Jackson.
Well, let's not deal with that. Let's deal with the reality. Let's deal with the reality. The news media has indicted all black youth. When you see the crimes perpetuated on the news media, and it's a black young man, it inevitably is an indictment of all black youth. Most crimes in America are committed by white folks. 85% of the related crimes and drugs are white folks. 85% of the drug-related crimes are by white folks. most and the majority of the thievery and drunkenness is white folks.
Right.
But you do not have that image, and you do not have the whites going into the jail process and going into the jailhouse. We've got to understand racism in America and what it means.
Now, while you're watching this, consider the agony of those who would presume who are honestly trying. Professor Jeffries included was asked to contribute, make his contribution to what should be in social studies textbooks for our children to read.
And
can
we
you
said the
imagine?
truth.
Would
And
you
we
like to be
said
a
the
fly
truth.
on the wall in this discussion involving Native Americans, Asians, Hispanics, African Americans, Latinos? I'm being called on. Hispanic is not an acceptable word. It's too broad.
But
it
Phil,
doesn't cover every
Phil,
culture.
relax.
Who's this white guy
Relax.
think he is?
Relax.
Deciding what
Phil.
umbrella I fall under.
Phil,
It's hard for me
relax.
to relax. I get excited on
No,
important
have a-
issues.
have a glass
And
of
we'll
water.
be back in just a moment.
Have a glass of water.
You wanted to say what, Professor?
I just wanted to clarify the issue in terms of the curriculum review that was put in place in 1988. 4 consultants were asked to be a part of that process. To handle the look at the curriculum in terms of the Native American was a Professor White. To handle the curriculum over 100 documents, 150 documents, to handle it from the point of view of the Asian American was a professor from Hunter College. To handle it from the point of view of the Latino was also a professor from Hunter College, Dr. Fratricelli Rodriguez. And I handled it from the African American. All of us agreed, after looking at 150 documents, that the curriculum of the state of New York, even though they had made a number of changes, was not good enough to take us into the 21st century where we need a global perspective on the world. It is as if only one person reviewed the curriculum of the state of New York, and only one person influenced the decisions to be made. They specifically singled out Leonard Jeffries and the African American to create this hysteria. But I believe truth crushed to earth will rise again and again, stronger.
Over here, please. Yes, sir. Hold it.
What I like to say is that I hear a lot of people calling Dr. Jeffries a bigot, a racist, an anti-this and an anti-that, and nobody's doing their work. Nobody's going out there to read if what he's saying is out of his mind or if it has some foundation of some
review what he
data.
says, you're saying.
Before you call anybody anything, go do your homework.
Yes. Yes. Briefly. No speeches. You'll be brief.
I'm interested in Dr. Jeffries' reaction to the story in, I think it's yesterday's Time, regarding the curriculum success in the change, the curriculum of inclusion
New York Times
in the
magazine.
state of California,
Yes.
without apparently the nastiness and the antagonism that seems to result from his remarks.
Well, I think we need clarity on that. Nothing has resulted from my remarks. Even the speech that I gave that was played in Albany was played for 2 weeks, listened to by 100,000 people, including many Jewish, and there was not one letter, one response that was negative. It was after the vote of the Board of Regents, July 26, when they had lost the struggle over curricular change, when even Nathan Glazer moved over with the majority and left Arthur Schlesinger in terms of being in opposition. They had lost that struggle. July 26th, the Board of Regents voted to change the curriculum and institutionalize the process to bring about change. Then they went into Project Chaos, and that's when the troubles over my remark occurred. There has not been I've been making remarks like this for 20 years. I was involved in a search for the black family history in terms of enslavement, which came out of and was related to the Alex Haley Roots Project. And these books that you see here, the Donahue books on the slave trade, a 4-volume study. We've been dealing with these things for 20 years. This is not something that just came up yesterday, but we've got to deal with it now in a more important way because Christopher Columbus is coming up next year in 92.
Are you there, caller? Give this caller a chance.
Columbus is coming up next year in 92.
Yes.
And I believe that people who understand what Columbus was all about and look at the underside of history.
Yes. May I share with you the ruckus that developed in Professor Jeffries' hometown in New Jersey? Here are some folks from New York. This is how impassioned this has gotten. Show them this. You can continue to make your point.
In that community, and the Jewish community stood with the black community against the people who came into that community.
Yes. Here are, incidentally, I don't think anyone was injured here, but it did get ugly, as you can see. And the right to march was granted by the New Jersey Supreme Court. Are you there, caller?
Phil.
Yeah.
This man is 100% right because black folks have been systematically brainwashed for over 400 years. But anytime a strong black man stands up to tell the truth, he threatens white America. He's also a threat to George Bush's so-called New World Order.
And we'll be back in just a moment.
Professor Jeffries, I'm very saddened here today. I thought we were all God's children. But all I can say is, I wish you luck. May God be with you.
Well, we are all God's children, but the African has been subject to the most serious defamation of any peoples in the world, and we are making sure that that will change.
That does not permit you to imply that the Jews were the major hand behind America's agonistic path.
I don't think he's ever implied that. And I'd like to see in this audience or in the outer audience that's listening and watching, produce one memo, one document, or one book to refute any of the things that he has stated in truth.
All right, yes.
Professor Jeffries, I love the comment when you say some of the Jews are my best friends. We've heard that before. You're the worst kind of anti-Semite because you don't admit to being one, but your whole following is anti-Semitic.
Yes.
I'd like to say I'm a student in Dr. Jeffries' class, and I believe that if we all can just put aside our preconceived notions of racism and just listen to what he's saying, I think we'll all benefit.
Yes.
For those people who say that Dr. Jeffries is anti-Semitic, the prefix in the word Semite means semi. Semi what? Semi-black, semi-white. Jews are black and white people, and that's it.
I'd just like to say that we all can pray to God, and hopefully our children will get the real history of the earth.
Phil? Yes, let's get this one.
If we're allowed to investigate who was ahead of the Gestapo for the Holocaust, why can't we find out who were the brain behind slavery?
That's right. Yes.
Why can't we work towards getting the curriculum in without knocking any other groups?
And we'll be back in just a moment.
And what we are and what we're supposed to be, our response is to go the high road, to get into an understanding of who and what you are, study in these books. We put in place a 50-week course in which we want our community to start researching and studying. So we move to a higher intellectual and spiritual road, knowing that we are the people who began the march of humankind in Africa. We are the people who raised it to its highest levels in Africa and continue to struggle in America for that particular truth. It's not a question of being anti-anybody, but it's a question of being pro-us. There is 100 million African bodies that come out of the death and destruction of the European experience, and we want to make sure that our ancestors hold us accountable for doing the right thing in reference to that. Other people talk about their Holocaust.
Services provided and promotional fees paid by the following.